everybody. Thank you for sticking it out for our last session of this amazing two-day conference. I'm very pleased to be chairing this last session. My name is Tom Deligiannis. I teach at Wilfrid Laurier University, but I'm also part of CSAC with Bruno. And this fourth conference has been a great 2 days. And we really look forward to this last session to help us distill some of the lessons and essentially try to identify some important first steps to deal with the myriad challenges to Canadian and allied security policy in light of multiple global disruptions and, of course, the environmental and climate disruptions that we're all facing in coming decades. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists before we start with our online panelists first. So our first panelist is Brigadier-General Marc, who is the commander of Joint Task Force North. Brigadier Perron is joining us online, as I said. Brigadier Perron has held various staff and command positions, including Canadian Exchange Officer with the U.S. Army's 21st Theater Support Command in Germany, Canadian Army G4 Operations, Canadian Joint Operations Command J4 Systems. There's a whole actual litany of different commands that he's held, which show his many years of experience and service to Canada. In July 2024, he was appointed Director General of the Professional Conduct and Development within the Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture in Ottawa. And most recently, in May 2026, he assumed command, as I said, at Joint Task Force North in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. And we appreciate and thank General Perron for joining us today. Following General Perron, we will have the panelists you can see to my right. Many of you have already heard from our panelists, so I'm just going to briefly introduce them. Sara Carswell, who is the Deputy Director of Climate Change and Security for Global Affairs Canada, directly to my right. Rachel Samson, Vice President of Research for the Institute for Research on Public Policy, based in Montreal. The institute is based in Montreal. Next to Sara. Then we have Pauline Baudu, who is the head of the Climate Security Program at the CDA Institute. And finally, of course, Bruno Charbonneau, CSAC Casco, RMC Saint-Jean, multiple hats, man about town on climate change. So, Brigadier General Perron, I turn it over to you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bon après-midi. Ulukut Dante. It's a pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, could not join you for the full 2 days, but happy to be here and hopefully add to the discussion and what important topics you are bringing to the forefront. I'll be beginning by situating where I come from and the responsibilities I carry as the Canadian Armed Forces and DND's senior representative in the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic. As commander of the Joint Task Force North, my mandate is to uphold Canada's sovereignty, advance security, and stability across the region, and support whole-of-government efforts aligned with Global Affairs Canada, foreign policy on the Arctic, as well as Canada's defense policy, our North strong and free. This panel, as I understand it, asks a broader question, not just how climate change affects operations, but how it is reshaping defense institution, how we design, sustain, and employ our military capability in a fundamentally different environment. The area of responsibility that I have the pleasure and privilege to be part of covers, as you know, over 40% of Canada's landmass and 75% of our coastline. It's a region where climate change is reshaping the strategic environment faster than anywhere else across the country. So I'll keep my remarks grounded on that reality and what we are seeing here in the Canadian Arctic Theater operation and what it means for defense and how we, D&D and the CAF, are adapting. In the North, climate change is not a future scenario. It's a daily operation condition. We're seeing 4 big things that I would like to offer. Longer open water seasons does not necessarily mean safer. Less predictable ice conditions, increased human activity, be it domestic or international, and more frequent and complex emergencies requiring responses. For JTFN, this translates into demand. More demand for presence, more demand for mobility, and more demand for partnerships. And all of this is happening, as you've discussed in these 2 days, in an environment that's becoming less predictable, complicating planning, conducting operations, logistics, and the limited infrastructure that we have across the theater. When we talk about climate change here and security in JTFN, our perspective is that it's fundamentally about access, awareness, and responsiveness in a changing physical environment. Ce que cela signifie pour la défense, c'est ce que nous vivons n'est pas simplement un ajustement opérationnel. Il s'agit d'un changement institutionnel plus profond. Les changements climatiques nous obligent à revoir nos hypothèses quant à notre zone d'opération, à la manière dont nous soutenons nos forces, à la conception de nos infrastructures et à l'évaluation de notre état de préparation. Premièrement, en termes de présence et souveraineté. À mesure que l'accès augmente à notre région, les attentes augmentent également. Nous devons être en mesure d'opérer de façon fiable et dans davantage d'endroits sur de plus longues périodes et dans des conditions qui ne sont plus aussi stables qu'auparavant. Deuxièmement, l'infrastructure et le soutien. Une grande partie des infrastructures sur lesquelles nous comptons dans le Nord, dans l'Arctique canadien, a été construite pour une réalité climatique différente et surtout dans un siècle dernier. La dégradation du pergélisol, l'évolution des conditions météorologiques et le manque de redondance ont tous des impacts sur notre capacité à projeter et à soutenir les opérations. Troisièmement, les partenariats. Nous n'opérons pas seuls dans le Nord, que ce soit la défense ou les forces armées canadiennes. Notre efficacité repose sur des relations solides, basées sur la confiance avec des gouvernements territoriaux, des communautés autochtones, les autres partenaires fédéraux et, lorsque demandé ou à l'invitation du Canada, nos alliés internationaux. Les changements climatiques amplifient le besoin de ces partenariats sans s'y substituer. Quatrièmement, la résilience communautaire et institutionnelle. Il existe également un besoin croissant pour les détenteurs de droits autochtones, les gouvernements territoriaux, les municipalités et les communautés nordiques de renforcer leur résilience. Leur capacité à se préparer, à intervenir et surtout à se rétablir face à un nombre croissant d'événements naturels ayant des répercussions sur la sécurité et leur qualité de vie. Si cette résilience n'évolue pas, je crois que votre dernier panel portait là-dessus, si cette résilience n'évolue pas au rythme que l'environnement change, climatique, la défense nationale risque de ne plus pouvoir jouer son rôle d'instrument national de dernier recours. Dans le Nord, la résilience des communautés, des autres ministères, des infrastructures civiles essentielles n'est pas distincte de la défense. Elle en fait partie. In the North, the resilience of communities and other government departments, whatever level they are, and critical civilian infrastructure is not separate from defense, it is defense. Notre capacité de collective à résister aux perturbations et à s'en remettre influence directement la posture de sécurité et de souveraineté du Canada dans la région. North exposes limits to last century energy solutions. Hard fuels, be it diesel, JP8, or other legacy systems, are costly to move, vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, environmentally unstable and unsustainable, and increasingly inadequate for the infrastructure that we are planning or building. There's also a broader tension that we must acknowledge. As DND and CAF increases investment to meet the evolving security environment and demands, we are risking reinforcing systems that are energy sensitive or intensive and carbon dependent. So the challenges are not simply to add capabilities in the North, it's also to do so in a way that reduces vulnerability and aligns with the reality of a changing climate. If we intend to operate effectively in the Arctic in the 2030s and the 2040s, we cannot rely on 20th century energy technology. This is why DRDC, and I believe you had panels members and participants from DRDC and other Government of Canada team partners are advancing both basic and applied research through numerous programs, be it Borealis with the DRDC, identified in the Defense Industrial Strategy, as well as what we need to do. This work is essential and not optional. If we want to be ready, reliable, and resilient, and lots of ands there, I must admit, sustainable energy solutions for northern operation, northern infrastructures, and northern communities are required. In the Arctic, energy is an operational enabler. Comment que la force opérationnelle interarmée NORS s'adapte? Au niveau opérationnel et tactique, nous sommes déjà en train de nous adapter de plusieurs façons. Nous ajustons la façon dont nous planifions et exécutons les opérations en tenant compte, par exemple, de la condition de la glace, de la météo et de l'accès à de plus en plus, l'accès qui est de plus en plus imprévisible. Nous mettons l'accent sur la connaissance du domaine afin de comprendre ce qui se passe dans la région, vaste et de plus en plus active. Nous renforçons nos relations avec les communautés et les autres ministères et organismes fédéraux, car leur connaissance locale et la coordination sont essentielles au succès. En tant qu'employeur de la force pour les Forces armées canadiennes dans l'Arctique, représentant l'équipe, nous veillons à ce que les forces qui nous sont assignées, qui viennent du Sud, peuvent opérer efficacement, puissent survivre à l'environnement et l'évolution apportée par le changement climatique. Et rien de tout cela est théorique. Il s'agit d'un travail concret en cours à chaque jour lorsque je regarde les opérations qui ont lieu de façon semi-permanente. Operation on Nanook is an example associated with science and technology. It remains our primary framework for presence and near persistent operations in the Canadian Arctic. That mandate will not and does not change. What is changing is the way that we integrate science and technology into the operation. We're now deliberately incorporating science and technology experimentation objectives into the initial desired effects and objectives of the operations that we conduct. Not as add-ons, not as opportunistic trials, but as planned components of how we generate value from the operation now and in the future. This does not mean that Operation Nanook is the sole venue for Arctic experimentation within DND and the CAF. There is the Canadian Forces Warfare Center, along with each of the Canadian Armed Forces force generators, be it the Canadian Air Force, Navy, Army, as well as Special Operations Command, that do help and do conduct experimentation in the Arctic. In addition, we have the NATO Cold Weather Operations Center of Excellence that also contributes to this Arctic experimentation and expertise. Op Nanook is a place that we can align operational tasks to the priorities in a coherent and repeatable way. This includes specifically work on 1, mobility, survivability, and sustainment of Arctic realities, two Arctic realities. Number 2, sensors and communication. 3, energy and power systems. 4, logistics models. And 5, dual and multi-use capabilities that benefit both defense and the communities. By embedding experimentation into the operations objectives, at the outset, we ensure that Nanook continues to evolve, not just as an operation, but as a national platform for learning, adaptation, and capability development in the North. L'intégration avec les communautés en amont. Un autre changement en cours concerne la façon dont nous concevons et nous mettons en œuvre les projets dans le Nord pour la défense. Les capacités telles que mentionnées à double usage ou multiple usage ne sont plus une réflexion après coup, particulièrement dans le contexte de changement climatique. Elles sont intégrées dès le départ dans la planification des projets et programmes. Les communautés nordiques ne sont pas des parties prenantes. Ils sont des partenaires et ce sont sur leur terre que nous sommes. Leurs besoins, leurs connaissances et leurs priorités façonnent les projets et les programmes que nous mettons de l'avant à la défense. Ce n'est pas seulement la bonne approche, c'est la seule qui fonctionne dans le Nord. Et j'ai appris ça rapidement. Practical considerations going forward that I would like to offer. From where I sit, there are a few practical considerations that are worth keeping in mind. Number 1, building for tomorrow's Arctic, not yesterday's. If we build for yesterday's Arctic, we will be behind from the start. Resilience, redundancy, readiness matter as much as capacity. Infrastructure, logistics, and systems must function in a more volatile and less predictable environment. Number 3, partnerships are capability. What we can do alongside others, be it communities, different levels of government, other government departments, as well as allies, will define our effectiveness more than any single platform or system. Number 4, the energy transition is an operational necessity. Without reliable, sustainable energy, northern operations remain constrained. And number 5, experimentation must be embedded, not episodic. Nanook gives us a platform for that. In closing, in the North, climate change is not abstract. It's shaping how we move, how we operate, and how we ensure Canada remains secure in a region of growing importance. Our task is not to predict every change. It's to remain present, adaptable, and credible in face of those challenges and changes. So for a Northern operational perspective, the question is not whether climate change matters for defense. It's how quickly and how committed we are prepared to adapt our institution to it. I look forward to hearing from others how they are approaching the challenge across the defense enterprise. And if we get that right, we will be well positioned as a nation, as a people, to meet both the challenges and the opportunities ahead. Thank you. Masisho Namik. Merci. I look forward to the discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Brigadier General Perron. Thank you for your comments. I'm going to turn it over now to Sara.
We've heard from our defense colleagues. Thank you, Brigadier-General Perron. I guess I can speak to a certain extent from the Global Affairs Canada perspective. Since I'm not quite retired yet, I won't entirely speak from my own personal perspective, but I will try to be as open as I can be, because I think that we're all here in the spirit of collaboration towards a common goal, which is to try to prepare Canada and all our countries for the impacts of all shocks, and the biggest one for us is climate change. So I was trying to think about what I could do to contribute here with all this expertise. I'm a policy advisor, and I've been a bit of a jack of all trades, a corporate lawyer, and then working in the energy sector in Canada, and working in the nonprofit sector and humanitarian landmine clearance, and been at Global Affairs for about 10 years now, working on disaster risk reduction, women, peace and security, so peace operations, and then for the last 4 years working on climate and security in our security and defense relations. So I hope that shows that, Global Affairs is working on this. The Canadian government is working on these issues. But I would say we have a small capacity to do so, and we really can't do this work without being informed by this community. So I'd like to thank Bruno and Tom and Will and all the others who've started this CSAC. I had the pleasure of coming here 4 years ago, and I've really seen the evolution of it. And I really think it's vital for us to be able to break down these silos and have these conversations. So I thought maybe it might be helpful to at least give my perspectives on a key question that I think was asked in different ways by different people. How do you get strategic buy-in for climate action? I think that's how Captain Sherda put it. How do you get buy-in? And I think the answer has already been shared, which is that you demonstrate, you show the strategic advantage and the opportunity. It's a strategic opportunity. And that's about risk. And speaking from the bureaucratic point of view, I'll just say, it's important that the topic, our theme is enabling defense in the era of climate security. So I guess I would start by saying, that defense is an actor. Our ministries of defense are key actors in this, but they're not the only ones. And I think that, at least from my perspective, you may not see it this way, but I feel like we really are all partners. And as I tried to say before when I stood up, it's important that there are not just pressures, but imperatives, like there's information coming from all different perspectives so that we're informed, because what we want is informed policy making, and we want to inform the decision makers. But I think what was also brought up was the issue of inertia, and how do you overcome inertia? So maybe I have a couple of my own reflections on that. I think it's important, these are obvious things that I'm saying, but just to remind us, we have democratic control of armed forces. So it's important that citizens play their roles to elect representatives and to hold them responsible for the things that they care about. And individual citizens do that, but we also need to come together in groups, interest groups, to bring those, as academics, civil society, what have you, but also the private sector. I actually started my climate policy journey in the private sector. I learned about the issues of the real risks of climate change in the Alberta energy sector, believe it or not. And this was maybe a bit of a naive era, but the energy sector in Alberta, at least some actors, were really galvanized by the Rio Summit and the Kyoto Protocol era to say, this is a risk we need to manage. And there were a lot of scientists, geologists, engineers saying, yeah, if we can't measure this, we can't manage it. I think that's something that I've heard as well from others in the conversations. So we're speaking the same language, but we kind of need to come together. And I'll just share that I've learned a lot about NATO in the last few years, thanks to people like Jordan, who are bridges. But I would say that it's not what I expected. NATO is, in an era where the rules-based international order is a bit wobbly, and I'd always, frankly, look to the UN. And I have a legal background, so looking at the international law and so on. But the coalition, the consensus building that happens at NATO is really quite something. And remember that there's a political element at NATO as well as a military element, and that's a place where the politics and the military, these officers come together and they need to work things out. So I would say that if you don't know, you care about this issue and you don't know much about NATO, get to know more about NATO. Because as people like Bruno working in these streams, I think they could use the support, and they are interested maybe in the things that they can bring to NATO. And I would just say that we indicated this, but although, frankly, I'm a little relieved as a public policy officer not to have to attend the big events. It was great that we had the NATO Climate Security Center of Excellence launch at the NATO Summit in 2024 in Washington. That was a huge achievement. And Colonel Tangeau's here, and Martin Arnes was here, who helped set that up with Norway. That was a really proud achievement for Canada, and we had a lot of support, including from the US, at that event. And so that was a really high point for visibility. And that, of course, has declined now. But that doesn't mean, we weren't sure what was going to happen. But I will tell you that even though it got quiet on the world stage, in fact, what I saw was people doubling down. and saying, okay, actually, we're a little worried about this. This doesn't have high visibility anymore, but we know climate change is happening. We know it has an impact. What are we going to do about it? And I'm really grateful that the Centre of Excellence, which honestly has been set up in record time in some challenging circumstances, because it's a big thing to launch. It's really kind of marked the spot. It's put this issue on the map at NATO, and I really hope that that's here to stay. So get to know the NATO Casco too, and go to the Montreal Climate Security Summit if you can. I'll also say that in the federal government, I'm an advocate, and in the federal government, we asked ourselves at Global Affairs Canada, right now we're a mighty team of 2, Jordan and myself, but we said, look, we know, I've worked at Environment Canada in the past as well, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people like us in different departments who are working on these issues and thinking, how do we connect? How do we grow our knowledge? How do we work together? So I said, well, we have this really nice room at Global Affairs Canada. Let's have a meeting. So in September, we started a community of practice, and we just said, let's come together. And it was interesting because I think initially everyone wanted to talk about, well, how do we define climate security? But I think what we concluded, and I expected this honestly, is that each of us has our own way of defining it. And it's thinking about how, and feeling empowered because everyone else is kind of experiencing the same way, to just go forth and figure it out and see how climate change is impacting, and then share best practices on how to advocate for that in your own chain of command. How to make work from the bottom, we're not entirely the bottom, but let's working level up through the chain of command. And then ideally, I think that from outside government, I've been there too, civil society will try to meet with the political level or at the senior level of management in government. And that's also important because you want the signals to be coming from the top, that this is important, it's worth prioritizing. But then I think maybe what's missed is that the working level is very valuable because sometimes, especially at the speed of thought that we're traveling right now in public policy right now in Ottawa, we're being asked to come up with answers for events that have just happened. We're all reading the news and figuring out what our assignment's going to be the next day. So meeting together regularly, sharing information. I'm happy that Rachel Samson's organization's here because they're really a key conduit for sharing public policy ideas. I hope that we can connect better with them. So I just say, just remember, something I learned when I came to Ottawa from the private sector was, 10% of the government is sort of influenced by the political level. This is maybe an old percentage, but I think it still stands. And then 80%, 90% is the bureaucracy. And that's a good thing because, that can ensure that bureaucrats, especially those that have a tenure, can speak truth to power. But I think what's really important is that we give those bureaucrats an ability to understand the problem and to understand that it's our problem and how they can help solve it, that we can help them solve their problems by giving them data and science-based evidence so that they can make a good case for why this is important, what the strategic advantage is, what the strategic opportunity is for them, and how to manage risk. And then I think that we need to also, frankly, just from the diplomatic point of view, it's always helpful to know that Canada's in good company. So that's where the foreign affairs part comes into it. I'm really grateful for the other countries that have joined us in the NATO Casco so that we can say, well, this is what France is doing, this is what Norway's doing, this is what Germany's doing. And so we're in good company and we're working together. And this is really important for Canada right now to feel that we're part of that community. So the final point I'll just make is, kind of picking up on some of the calls to action. We need a whole of society approach. We need to work together, and we need to be curious and open to people with different sets of experience and different perspectives. And we need to work hard together and never give up.
Thank you very much, Sara. And you've actually been along the ride with CSAC for 4 years and at every conference, and your message has been consistent over those 4 years about building community, bringing everybody together. It's a message that Blair Brimmel and Jordan have also managed to get across. And and I've been very impressed with how the NATO experience also seems to embody that approach as it comes to climate security. Turn it next to Rachel Samson.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak about something that's a bit narrower than some of the things we've been talking about, but in the solutions realm. And I'm going to focus on some research that we've been doing at the IRPP, looking at the role of industrial policy in meeting some of our public policy challenges. And this draws on research over the past several years, and particularly a report that we published in September 2025, looking at the role of industrial policy in helping to improve Canada's economy and sovereignty. But there's other research that we've done that I think I mentioned yesterday, looking at how to support workers and communities through economic transformation. And that includes the net zero transition, but also disruption from tariffs from US or China, as well as other things. And we also publish a number of papers by external authors that feed into what I'm going to say as well. So what is industrial policy? There are a number of definitions out there. We chose to say that it's anything governments do that deliberately encourages certain economic activities, investments, and outcomes that would not otherwise happen through market forces. So it's basically government intervening in some way into the economy in order to achieve a public policy objective. There are many different types of industrial policy, so it could be sector-focused, for example, trying to build defense industrial capacity. It could be technology-focused. You want to have sustainable aviation fuels. You want to improve battery technology, those types of things. Mission-oriented, so we want to source 70% of defense procurement in Canada. That is a mission-oriented goal. It can be place-based. We want capabilities in the north. We want to develop a maritime defense tech industry in Atlantic Canada. There are many aspects that can be pursued. It can be tax incentives. It can be grants. Procurement can be used. Procurement isn't always industrial policy. If you're just procuring something for your own operational needs, that is not what I would consider industrial policy. If you are using procurement to help build a domestic defense industry or help build certain capabilities in Canada, that would be industrial policy. There are some new tools coming out too, offtake agreements, contracts for difference, all these sorts of things that can really help to overcome some of the barriers that the private sector faces in terms of doing some of the things we would like them to do. If you'd asked people in the federal government, a few years ago, do they do industrial policy? Many of them would say, no, we don't. We don't do industrial policy. But the numbers show a different story. Yes, they do industrial policy. There is a lot of funding going to private companies across all federal departments and provincial governments. So the question becomes, is industrial policy being done well to achieve priority outcomes and in the most efficient way possible? And I think that is a much bigger question. If we look back at this data from 2022, you don't see defense there, really. I mean, there were some programs that I said, but it was small. This is going to change, as we know, both in terms of the Defense Investment Agency, but also in terms of some of the things that you see up here, like Business Development Bank of Canada, getting more into the defense space. So industrial policy is going to be a major tool that's used to achieve some of the things we've been talking about. So yesterday I mentioned the term multi-solving. So this is the idea of trying to achieve multiple public policy objectives through the interventions that we make. The interesting thing about industrial policy is that you can use it to help achieve multiple objectives at once. So here I'm, talking about strategic infrastructure investments, strategic projects, but the full table in our report goes into, strategic technology investments, including defense tech, strategic sectors like critical minerals. All of those things can be used by the careful design of industrial policy or by adding in complementary measures to make sure that they achieve multiple policy objectives. So if we're talking about defense investments, that we also want to achieve emission reductions, or we also want to support adapting to a changing climate, it is possible to design industrial policy tools to do that by adding different criteria, using different mechanisms. Also in there on Indigenous reconciliation. So if you have, for example, a critical mineral investment and you want to ensure that it's benefiting the local Indigenous populations, it's possible to help structure financing to ensure that they have an equity stake in that project and that they're seeing financial flowbacks for their community. So industrial policy can play a role in helping to achieve all of those things with a similar project. Another piece of research that we've done, as I mentioned, is looking at community susceptibility to various things. So net zero transition, so that's mainly communities that have emissions-intensive forms of production with high concentrations of employment in those sectors. But we also did analysis on changes in U.S. trade policy, which communities are going to be hurt by that. And when I'm talking about hurt, I mean communities where if that sector closed, they're going to see widespread impacts across the community. Not just the loss of those jobs at that facility, but falling housing prices throughout the community, closing restaurants, devastation sort of beyond just the individual workers. That's what we're focused on. And we know that there are particular areas of susceptibility across Canada. And that goes to the broader economic resilience point too. When we're talking about countries that have economic leverage over us, we need to shore up our economic resilience domestically so we're not so fearful of some of these changes that other governments can make that can have those devastating impacts at the community level in particular. And so part of that is looking at place-based industrial policy, and as we're making defense investments, whether the investments we're making in defense or the supply chain supporting those investments are helping to shore up that economic resilience across Canada. All of that sounds like I am a major proponent of industrial policy, so I will just say that I am not. Industrial policy done badly can be very harmful. There's a reason people call it corporate subsidies, that, corporate handouts. People lament that governments aren't good at picking winners. Everyone has an example of industrial policy done badly, and many of those are right. So the key thing is that we need to do industrial policy very carefully, and we need to make sure that it is done well. So that was the focus. A large focus of our report was how to do industrial policy well, to achieve the objectives in the most efficient way possible. And so we have three main aspects of doing it well: sound strategy, good governance, and rigorous evaluation. And all of those components are critical. On the strategy side of things, we've advocated for developing a comprehensive industrial strategy. And so this is a way, it's great that we have a defense industrial strategy, but because climate change wasn't mentioned very much in it, we need something that's more comprehensive, that's cutting across all of the different public policy issues that we're facing so that we can start to identify those synergies and put them into action. On the good governance side, we have advocated for using some of these arm's length institutions like the Defense Investment Agency. And that doesn't mean outsourcing the strategic considerations. Those are still best done within government. Governments are best placed to identify the objectives, the mandate of these organizations, and to hold them to account. But the day-to-day decision-making on which projects, which industrial policy tool, how to structure those things are best done by people with expertise, like financial sector expertise, that can really sort of get into that and avoid some of these problems that we've seen in the past with industrial policy. The evaluation side of things is also really critical, and governments have tended to do it badly. So this isn't just looking at, did we spend the money? It is, are we achieving the results we set out to achieve? And making sure that we're pivoting those policies along the way or rolling them back if they're not working and trying new things. This has not been done very well. Programs tend to go in, be put in place and not be removed, and people are reluctant to adjust things over time. So in terms of the recommendations that we made, as I mentioned, more of a comprehensive industrial strategy. We also recommended a real focus on what is holding back private investment. So we don't think that governments should be intervening if the private market is already doing it. It is really in cases where you want the private sector to do something that they're not doing right now. And then the question is, why aren't they doing that? And what would it take for the government to have that happen? So very like the minimum intervention needed to achieve that public policy goal. As I mentioned, there is a lot of spending already happening on industrial policy, so there's huge potential to reorient and review what's happening right now towards different priorities. And we did recommend as well establishing a Centre of Excellence on industrial policy to try and have best practices from within Canada and around the world applied to all the industrial policies we're pursuing right now. And then leveraging the capacity, as I said, of skilled arm's length institutions. So hopefully we can learn the lessons on industrial policy and start to apply them to help achieve some of the defense and climate objectives that we've talked about over the course of the conference.
Thank you, Rachel. Next, I'm going to turn to Pauline from the CDA Institute. Please take it away, Pauline.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to talk about another angle of the policy sphere from the think tank perspective. So I'm talking for the CDA Institute, the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, which is Canada's leading defense think tank, and so our role is to convene and to convene conversations, convene defense experts, defense industry stakeholders, and making sure that the decision, the operationalization of Canada's defense strategy is made in an informed way, humbly. But that's the think tank element of it. I think. And it's a good segue, actually, because a lot of our work right now is obviously shaped by the generational defense investments that have been announced and that are going to be operationalized in the next decades. And one element of it, because I understand a lot of Canada's climate and defense policy has been covered over the past 2 days, so I won't go over this. But one element also that is shaping a lot of our work and influencing our work is the Defense Industrial Strategy that was released end of 2025. And it has a lot of relevance for the climate security program that I lead, because it depends on how you see the glass. If you want to see it half full or half empty, some may have said that it was a missed opportunity and that climate change, which has had a very important role in the defense agenda in the past years and since 2021 and following NATO's impetus. Obviously, it doesn't have it doesn't have the same position in the defense industrial strategy. You need to also assess things in the current geopolitical context, and I actually think that the industrial strategy does a really good job in positioning climate change in a way that resonates to its audience. The main two elements that focus on climate change and resonate with climate considerations are Arctic climate resiliency, and we've heard. We've had a good rundown with Brigadier-General Parent on why this is important from an operational and industrial perspective. The other one is energy sovereignty, and that's the objective. One of the objectives of the industrial strategy is to strengthen the domestic defense industrial base to reduce foreign reliance. And so there's an awareness of the importance of energy sovereignty. And so yes, it's basically the two elements that draw on climate considerations. I tend to see the glass half full, but I've heard some criticisms, but I also understand that this needs to be taken into account in today's geopolitical context. So the defense industrial strategy has, as I said, is shaping a lot of our work. Another element that is also may have an important impact on climate considerations within the defense sphere is the establishment of the Defense Security and Resiliency Bank. That might also shape some of the discussions. Well, we'll see how this materializes, but the fact that Canada will be hosting this bank with a strong resiliency component is also an opportunity to maintain the climate security agenda. Climate security on the agenda. But as we see it, really the reshifting of the priorities are really centered now. The climate security considerations are recentered on strengthening industrial sovereignty, economic resiliency, and national security alignment. So it's really against this background that we're now also adjusting the way we talk about climate security considerations to make sure it resonates with our audience. Because as we know, well, we're all convinced of the importance of climate security, integrating it in defense considerations, but it's not always the case with our broader defense audience, which comes from very different backgrounds and experiences. So there's a shift in framing. There's also a shift that we see in the way that our partners readjust their priorities. And we were talking about, well, the importance of industry. We're as a think tank, we work a lot with the defense industry, but the industry in its broadest sense, actually. So, and so we may tend to see defense industry stakeholders as lowering their prioritization of climate concerns. It might be true to a certain extent. I don't think it's erasing it at all. I see a lot of interest still in public-private partnerships in maintaining resiliency. There's a very big interest on dual-use technology in making it climate resilient. There's a big interest on operational energy, which was central in today's agenda, and mission resiliency. So it's just a language that may be shifting, but the considerations are still here. And so there's still work being done on this matter. The other aspect that I see shifting within the industry is with climate and energy stakeholders. And that's actually that's the other coin of, the other side of the coin that you see with the reprioritization of defense and climate on the global agenda, is that climate and energy actors do see the benefit of building on the generational defense investments and are actually more interested in talking with defense stakeholders to make sure that we connect and we build bridges, and to make sure that these investments have a dual use effect, both on decarbonization and climate resiliency. So they have seen a positive signal from the government in investment announcements. And I would say even that defense, and I'm talking from a Canadian perspective, but defense is less taboo than it used to be. I think in Canada nationally, in the national debate, defense, we used to talk more about security than about defense. It's not widely publicly accepted, and so you can see also the public acceptation of the generational defense investments. Actually making them climate resilient, these investments, is also a way to juggle with that public acceptability. And that's something that's not lost on defense industry stakeholders. And so the fact that we have new actors coming into our ecosystem and our work is also, it means that these actors, the climate and energy actors, they know there is an opportunity to build on these investments, making them available and beneficial for the broader societal resiliency. The thing is, they need to penetrate the defense ecosystem, and that is very hard. The defense ecosystem is not easy to understand when you're an outsider, and so that's where we, as a think tank, also have a role to play. And I was at a critical minerals for defense conference in Toronto last week, which is also interesting because that's an annual event that's organized by Energy and Mines on critical minerals. And this year was the first iteration that it was oriented towards defense investments. And so it really speaks to the importance of the interest of the critical minerals, energy, and climate sectors in understanding the scope and importance of the defense investments. The feedback that we've been receiving when talking with these actors is really the lack of understanding from their perspective. They having a hard time penetrating the defense ecosystem, and so they need bridges to better understand the stakes and the processes of procurement, but also of the actors and of the main debates. And so I was saying that that's what we do at the City Institute. We convene. We see it as one of the main opportunities for the months to come and perhaps years to come to make sure that in the conversations that we convene, we gather actors that are cross-sectoral and that we allow an understanding of the defense ecosystem to a broader spectrum of the industry. And that's what also the climate security program that I lead focuses on. It's on building research and dialogue to inform policy debates at the intersection of defense investment, economic sovereignty, and sustainability. In my opinion and in my perspective, it's ready to ensure that investments in defense and investments in climate, be it climate resiliency, decarbonization, Earth observation, are not seen as competing priorities because they are really not. But this is an understanding that, again, that we have here in this room, but it's really not as broadly accepted or even in the conversations. So that's something I try to elevate through the program. First, to make sure that Canada remains relevant and ready for the long-term operational landscape. It's good to invest. We need to invest to make sure that we invest in a world. In an operational world in 20 to 30 years. The dual-use focus, making sure that we can only elevate national security through also active societal resiliency, and making sure also that Canada can be seen as a source of stability in a volatile world, that sustainability enables operational effectiveness and strategic competitivity. One of the tools, and I'll finish with this, and that's one of my main projects with the program, is how am I doing with time? I have
30 seconds.
Ooh, okay, is the Montreal Climate Security Summit that I think has been already mentioned over the past 2 days, and I have to say that I'm really not the only one working on this summit. It takes a village. It is co-hosted by the Conference of Defense Associations Institute and the NATO CASCO, and we're very privileged to. This year is going to be the third co-hosted iteration. But it's the 5th iteration of the summit, and I think it has converted itself into one of the leading global forums on climate and defense, so the really defense aspect of security. And the objective is really to foster a cross-sectoral community of practice, generating actionable outcomes to inform allied policy decisions. It has been growing over the past years. over the past 2 years, we've received about 300 guests with high-level participation. So the idea is really to build community. We had the Minister of National Defense of Canada last year who came to talk and delivered a speech that continued to resonate across the climate security community of practice until now, because that was I think that was the most advanced framing of climate security that I've heard from in that level of from a policy perspective. Framing nature as a strategic asset, framing ecosystems protection as a form of deterrence. That's not something I had heard before from at that level of policy. And so yes, that's the building community aspect that we were talking about. And this year is going to be about making sure that investments are made in a climate smart way. And so we're engaging industry even more strongly than in the past years, making sure they have opportunities to exhibit and showcase real-world solutions. Now I'll stop here and yes, and just to say that a lot of people in this room and even at this table have been actively contributing to the success of the summit, either as members of the organization committee, leaders, session leads, participants, emotional support. So thank you to all also for this.
Thank you, Pauline. I don't want to pull out the red card, but it's in the light of the goal.
Well,
Bruno,
I was about to say, wait until you see this next CSAC edition. The MCSS hasn't seen anything yet. Just kidding. I'm not competing with the Casco, right? I had to say it, sorry. All right, so I know we're at the end of the day, and I was wondering why I put myself last on the last panel of the last day. But what I want to do as a sort of conclusion, reading Enabling Defense in the Era of Climate Security, is a sort of self-reflexive exercise. And I thank you all for emphasizing, Sara, the importance of community, building communities, and Tom, you mentioned it too. Rachel, I saw your few slides on expertise and center of excellence, so the need for that sort of very specialized knowledge, or at the very least people who know what they're talking about and doing. So I want to sort of reflect on where I've been personally. I won't talk about myself, but those are conversations I've had with myself and some colleagues and friends about why am I doing everything I do, when I get up in the morning, but also what we've done with Tom and Gabrielle and Will with CSAC, what I've been doing at the Casco with all sorts of colleagues, with Alex at the college. And I want to reflect about and what we've done over the last 2 days, to be clear. And I want to do that from a perspective of or my reflections on the production of knowledge. What does it mean to produce knowledge? What is knowledge? Whose knowledge? And that sort of thing. And the politics of building knowledge and expertise. I'm not going to go too much into the theory and the philosophy of all that. I don't want to bother you with that because but I do want to underline, I think, the challenges, the needs, the necessities, and maybe just raise a few questions and hopefully get also some solutions or ideas from you or help in doing and creating a bigger community. So let me first start by clarifying my claim yesterday when I said I don't think the military needs to know that much about climate change, because quite a few people came back to me and asked me or told me I disagree.
You got some heat from that.
Yeah, a little bit, apparently. Maybe I certainly did not explain myself properly. Because in my mind, I guess the assumption of it is that we have to disaggregate the military. And there's not one military. I mean, the captain earlier probably gave us a very crash course on how complicated the machine is. And so in my mind, it's not all the military personnel or even units or whatever that need to know climate change. I mean, that's the only point I was trying to make. I think there's a need for some climate literacy. I'll come back to that. But certainly, I think my intent was not to say they shouldn't. At the operational, tactical level, I think it is about the weather. I'm going to defend that idea. But it's the strategic level and political level, and that sort of plays defense planning process, foresight, whatever, that I think needs to think about the future, as we said over the last 2 days, and plan for the next operational, tactical needs and whatnot, the future of war question that we've raised several times over the last 2 days. So there is a need also for general climate literacy. But when I say that, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? What is climate literacy, and one that is useful for the military? What we think is they should know. What should the military know about climate change? And you know, I'm also reflecting, and I was pleasantly surprised to hear a lot of you over the last 2 days talk about culture. So I take that as organizational culture, but maybe even beyond that, just culture is a hard concept to define, but culture, imagination, innovation, possibilities. What world are we trying to build into the future? That to me is an incredible, important question. But we also talk about inertia, this sort of structural constraints that stops us from imagining a different world, even though climate scientists are telling us we are going to live, if we're not already there, on a different planet. Right? So we don't need to go to Mars to go to another planet. We are transforming the planet we're on. I also have in mind Professor Crawford's comment or answer to my question about how do we negotiate the short-term and long-term sort of temporal challenge, as I like to call it. And she said that it's our job, actually. It's the analyst, the researcher, the academics. But then I'm like, okay, so yeah, I like that. But there's a lot of unpacking to do there. Who's supposed to do what here? There's a politics to that. Academia loves its independence. Relationship between education, academics, expert, and the state is a power relations. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just going to leave it there. So production of knowledge, the ways in which we know the world, we experience it, we live it, we navigate it, you know, that's what it is. That's what living is. That's being and doing. And so, again, how do we or should we produce knowledge? What knowledge and news knowledge that we've called here climate security or climate security and defense? What are we talking about here? And several also people have said, well, actually, we know enough. There's enough information out there. There's enough knowledge already. Do we actually need to know more? And I've read that elsewhere in other contexts as well. We know enough. It is a matter of courage, to quote someone whose name I cannot remember. But yeah, it is very much about that, the use of knowledge, who uses it, what knowledge is being. So why am I bringing this up and trying to raise all these issues and questions? So that's a personal reflection. Throughout my career, I've always tried to my best bring in different people together because I need new ideas myself. It's sort of intellectual need also that when you read the same IR theory book all the time, it gets boring because it's repetitive and you're like, apparently they've never read philosophy or history or economics or anything. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling here. So diversities of communities is a diversity of ideas. That's how you learn, that's how you grow, that's how you build communities or new communities. But it also comes with different languages, different understandings, different cultures, to use that term. And let me be a bit more specific here about those challenges that I think we need to reflect on, because we have a pretty diverse, I like to think at CSAC we've been pretty diverse from all the perspective, all the ways in which you can define diversity. Certainly we've tried our best all the time. But in academia, just to give you one example, you have, when you say climate security, on the one side you have climate scientists, on the other side you have security defense academics or experts. We don't speak the same language. And in my experience, there are very little people in the middle who can know enough about both. I like to somewhat pretend I understand climate change, all right? But I'm still every day learning and trying to read as much as I can. But when I talk with, I always bring up that example, my friend Alex there in the back. Alex Giguère is a quantum chemist at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean. We're both professors, and we've been creating or building, and he's been leading it, to be frank, in the last 3 years or so, a new climate security program at the college for officer cadets. First few conversations we've had, we more or less talk past each other. And the joke I like to say is that when he asked me he asked me, give me numbers for geopolitics and humans. I'm like, man, you can't quantify the social. His mind exploded. I started laughing anyway. So it's an old joke or an old reference. But my point is that in academia itself, in the world of science, whether social or other sciences and the gaps in between, we love to say that we do multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research, but that's a challenge in itself. That's a huge challenge in the climate security defense sphere. And then you have other issues also. Who knows both of enough, like I said, but there's the structural constraints where academia and the research world will actually focus or encourage specialization over the generalist. So that's also an issue. What do you need here in that space? And on top of that, what we've been trying to do with CSAC, what's going on also at the CASCO and other places, community of practice that Sara mentioned, you add another layer or layers of practitioners. A lot of you here come from government. We had a few military people, policy decision makers, political actors, who again do not live in the same world and don't use the same language, do not understand or view the world as an academic or a scientist. And when you bring all these people in a room, and I love the last 2 days because this has been great. But sometimes that's what you're facing. What I like to say, the translation challenge. You talk past each other. So why? So cultural obstacles, cultural obstacles, administrative sometimes obstacles, structural constraints, theoretical conceptual challenges. Those are things I think need solutions, or at the very least we need to work at. So that's my conclusion. Solutions. How do we make this happen? That conversation that I hope we can sustain. But I would also say, and that's the sort of thing I'm hoping and still trying to build with your help, more than just once or twice a year, like a regular platform or organization or institution to have those conversations and to overcome these potential constraints and obstacles. So examples of quick attempts at doing that. The program I've mentioned on climate security at the Royal Military College that we're trying to build up, just to build a minimum of climate literacy within the forces. As they go up the rank, those officer cadets will become generals one day and whatnot. The CASCO is a great example, of course, of nations coming together, but also the CASCO has been set up to bring in, again, all sorts of different communities. It's not just military personnel out there. CASCO has expanded and been talking basically to everyone. The challenge there has been actually to say no to some people and drawing limits. Anyway, CSAC, I like to think CSAC is also trying to do that. I hope that's obvious. I've mentioned earlier to do the STO community within NATO. But those are all imperfect solutions. There are all sorts of issues there, like I said, both technical, structural, political. And I'm just saying here that hopefully you'll be with me in the next few months and years to continue building those communities and solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. We have about 30 minutes for questions and comments, and I'm going to challenge the audience as well, not just to give questions to the panelists, but also to reflect on what you've seen and heard over the last 2 days, what struck you about where we can actually make progress, what our first steps should be, what are our actionable items, in addition to perhaps questions you have for our panelists or Brigadier-General Perron, who I hope is still with us online. So please, if you have a question, line up at the microphone there, and we'll take you one at a time.
Okay, this is a question for Brigadier-General Perron. Brigadier-General, I was part of a team that co-designed and delivered Op Nanook Tadigit last year. So had the privilege of being up in Joint Task Force North and meeting your incredible people and the many stakeholders that are important for the whole of government, sort of whole of society exercise. I'm wondering what your thoughts are now as you take over your leadership role on what whole of society looks like in an evolving northern context with changing community dynamics, but also evolution of Indigenous relations, and if you just have any broader thoughts on the civil-military preparedness and cooperation and coordination.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the kind words for Operation Nanook Tatigit. That this year will be in the White Horse Yukon as we move it from one territory to the other each year. Great question. What I've seen since joining the team is that whole of society here in the north and not dependency, but I would say the trust levels between the departments. And when I say departments, I'm thinking specifically between the territorial governments, public safety, specifically RCMP, and now with the Coast Guard within the D&D, here in the north is stronger than what I've seen more to the south of Canada. And I've learned to, when I say south, having come from Ottawa, family's still there, when I say south here, it does not mean the United States or Mexico. South means Canada. I would say that the whole of society ecosystem is a bit stronger based on the necessity of working together. There's still ways to go. That's what I would add to you, sir. Thank you for the question. Hopefully it adds to the conversation.
Thank you, Brigadier-General Perron.
Now I just took a note. I think my question is mostly to Bruno, but maybe to all of you. More about like the language and the translation and the conceptions of security. And I was just in Yellowknife, actually, also at Joint Task Force North for some research. And we've talked about this a lot, deterrence for resilience, and the thing that like socioeconomic vulnerability is now seen as a national security threat. And I'm wondering how much of that is material changes in the threat perceptions and the actual threats coming, hybrid threats and so on, and how much of that is actually maybe a change of conception and language of what defense and deterrence mean. Yeah, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure how much what I'm talking about is dependent on material conditions. Is that basically what you're asking?
Well, yeah, I'm wondering how much of this, the socioeconomic vulnerability as a national security threat. Socioeconomic vulnerability has always been there, but it's now on the list of as a national security threat. More it's talked in the defense sector, talked about. So I'm wondering if that's a change of conception and language of what security means. If that's a form of translation.
Yeah. I think there are different ways. I have anecdotes in mind about, someone mentioned it yesterday, I can't remember who, but like there has been in the last 20, 30 years always the hope of some academics or activist groups working in a sort of environmental sphere thinking that if the Pentagon or defense takes climate and environment seriously, everyone else will take that seriously. Like you can see it in, around this sort of CNA report in 2007 and 8. The hope was that if Pentagon takes it seriously, all the government of the U.S. government will take that seriously. And you see that actually appearing in debates over the last decade. Well, back to, as far as I'm concerned, or I know, back to the 1990s, right? If you convince the military. So it tells us a lot about the sort of importance or demands we make on our defense institutions. More than it tells us about the defense. Well, it tells us a bit about the defense institution, the way that they reply to that. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that right now, and I could tell you, what I'm trying to build, for instance, we do have an interest from climate scientists because there is, let's be honest, there's a lot of money in defense. So there are all sorts of reasons why you want to engage defense. There's just that, money, resources, but there's also like the real issues, the politics, like I said, of what does it mean to build up defense and the military in Canada. And I think that you can definitely talk about social resilience and that sort of thing through a climate adaptation. So if you want to go towards more that sort of very civilian space, but you can also, someone brought up Article 3. You did, Sara, right? So Article 3 is also a sort of military defense language. So there are all sorts of spaces and opportunities for common language. Obviously, I think the devil's in the details after that, right? What does that mean when these communities that, like Philippe Gachon couldn't be with us today, but he spoke yesterday, there's a strong climate scientist community behind him or within or around him. He's part of, he's built some, and they definitely want to engage with what we do here for all sorts of reasons that I've already mentioned, and he mentioned too, slashing and so on and so forth. But does that make it bad or anything? I don't know if that's the implications of your implicit. I don't know, but I'm not sure if I answered fully your question. It's very complicated. I think we can probably. I'll need to think about it more. But I would say that when material conditions change, that's the German ideology. That's the book. Right? We need to write it. Material conditions impose structural constraints, or at the very least, they shape knowledge production. So as social conditions change, they will change conditions under which we can produce knowledge and this sort of knowledge that is being produced and used and so on and so forth. So maybe I should have started with that.
Thanks, Bruno. Before we jump to Burgess, Sara and Rachel also wanted to have a voice on this.
If I may, I just wanted to take the opportunity to respond to some of Bruno's questions and maybe double down on maybe it's a luxury, but I think that this CSAC is really important. Although, of course, having worked with the NATO CASCO and establishing it for the last 4 years, I'm a big supporter also of the Montreal Climate Security Summit, and I understand it's advantageous for the NATO CASCO to work with the CDA Institute, but there's a certain lens, a certain perspective there, and I think that's good. But I think it's important, like just from I'm giving again the public servant bureaucrat point of view. We're looking for signals. We're looking for policy signals, and I think it's important that you have more than one and multiple sources of groups figuring out the questions that we should be asking. And I was thinking about Jordan's panel, and when Victor was talking about how it's great to be a researcher, it's important that researchers can just look at whatever they think is good to look at to solve the problem. And I mean, with respect to what we do in government and so on, there are certain curation of who speaks, and there's I'm not against the private sector getting involved, but let's not be naive. Like, there's a lot of money being spent here, so there are certain private sector interests that are looking for opportunities to be heard. And I think that there will be a balancing in all venues, hopefully, to make sure that you have academics as well as private sector, as well as government, as well as civil society. But if you want to have the diversity of opinion and hopefully the good signals that you need to speak truth to power so that we're really coming up with real solutions, we need a CSAC. Or we need something like a CSAC as well as an MCSS. And that CSAC folks are bringing their ideas to that, and that MCSS people are bringing their ideas to the CSAC. So just saying it's important. So it's more of a statement really and like a bit of support. But we need the deep thinking, and we need to avoid the echo chamber, and we need the challenge function. So that's what I wanted to say.
Just on the socioeconomic question, I mean, as I said yesterday, I come at this as an economist, which is maybe a bit different than other people in the room. But I think what is new, and it was first started during the pandemic, when we had trouble sourcing PPE, supply chains, vaccines, all of those things. I think there's realization that economic integration had challenges. And then when there was, semiconductor shortages post-pandemic, spikes in prices, a lot of realization that, perfect integration without government being concerned about how private companies were organizing their supply chains was an issue. And then, of course, Donald Trump threatening to use economic force to make us 51st state, the imposition of tariffs, then China's imposition of tariffs, use of export controls. All of those things I think are increasing the realization that what's happening at the economic level really matters for our national sovereignty and the well-being of our population. And I do think that realization is relatively new over the past 5 years or so, and it's really changing how we're thinking about things. And it's one of the reasons that we're launching a project looking at trade diversification, because we do think it is such a fundamental issue for Canada, both in terms of diversifying where exports go, reducing those sources of vulnerability, but also on the supply chain side.
Okay, Sara, your comments segued perfectly into what I was going to ask. So I have a specific question for Pauline and then a sort of broad question for everybody. So, Pauline, you mentioned that CDA is, consulting with the energy sector a little bit. And so what I wanted to know is, can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means and like who in what kind of energy industry? And the reason I ask is because when I hear like novel energy ideas from people like Captain Sherda, I'm pretty trusting. That sounds like a great idea. But from my own experience, when there's a lot of money on the table, one of the first organizations to line up is the energy sector. And they come in offering, energy transition ideas and emissions reductions. And what they end up delivering is lies, right? Carbon capture projects, have been abysmal failures globally and especially in Canada, and the oil and gas sector keeps asking for more money. So the broad question of the panel is, how are we going to prevent some of these organizations coming and saying, hey, we want to help decarbonize defense, promising things like carbon capture, and then delivering absolutely nothing? So it's the deny, delay, deflect, and in this case, defraud, which is money that needs to be going to very legitimate defense things. So how do we prevent the energy sector, who has been very guilty of this for a long time, from continuing?
Next question. Next question.
You mean we're not going to comment on that?
No, of course, I was at.
I'm very happy to.
I will.
I took you seriously. I agree with you. Where's Burgess? Okay, I agree with you. So I wouldn't say we've been consulting just because we don't consult and we're thinking. What we do is convening dialogues, and we're a platform to convene and make sure that we have experts at the table that represent different perspectives on defense. And we have been approached by, but also been in touch with more energy and climate stakeholders because of the Climate Security Program and because of the Montreal Climate Security Summit, and because we're trying to highlight the solutions that we think are advancing, decarbonization because we don't want to say greening, but like in a broad way, but not too broad. And I think it's very important what you emphasized. And it's up to us to establish criteria of who we want to showcase and the solutions we're going to emphasize. That's something that's in the heart of the discussions that we're having within the MCSS organizing committee. So we're in very preliminary work of the discussions, because there are going to be, the idea is to showcase the solutions, and I see it as an opportunity for us to shape what we think are ethical solutions, and scalable. So these are different criteria that we're establishing in order to know who to showcase. And I agree with you on the carbon capture. So that's clearly not something that has been on the table for the Montreal Summit. I can't comment on this too much, but because it's still internal discussions. But I agree with you, and this is, as you say, because we're seeing generational defense investments, and so this is attracting a lot of interest. It's up to organizations like us and platforms like us to choose who we showcase. I hope that answers your question.
Before we get to the next question, Sara also wanted to intervene on Burgess's question.
Burgess, maybe we can have an offline conversation. But I would say, when I did work in the energy sector, I worked for TransAlta Energy in the early days of the carbon markets, and we were trying to create carbon offset projects. And what we needed to do was we had to be ready for people to challenge that, and we had to have good science and good data. So I would say, bring it on. I mean, I think that if energy sector proponents or anyone in any sector is going to bring something forward, they should have data and science and not be afraid of questions. And if they are, but I am going to push back a little bit on they're all liars, because I don't think that's quite, just saying, it's okay. It's an emotional issue, but I would just say, absolutely. Everyone should be prepared if they're coming to pitch something or they have an idea that they should. This is why I'm saying, as a public servant now, we want to have signals that we can trust from people, and we should be in a position to be able to ask questions. And I think that ideally we have this kind of forum where people in a curious and open way can share ideas and challenge each other.
If I can try to answer your question from another perspective, which is a climate security and defense perspective. What are we doing here is, if historically, and I would point again to the work of Professor Crawford, that there's a correlation, to put it mildly, between the rise of military power and the rise of fossil fuels, certainly in the case of U.S. foreign policy and history of military operations throughout the world. There's a strong correlation between the two. The question in this room, when we talked about the energy transition, for instance, military missions and whatnot, can you decouple that, right? Because there is a sort of firepower operational equipment issue that the captain has talked about and others, but there's also that sort of decoupling at the very structural level. And I would say that it goes back to what Greg said about the infrastructure of fossil fuels. Will the military continue to sustain or pay to sustain those structures or not? It is the question about how do we imagine the future of war without fossil fuel. Can you imagine that? What does that look like? What does that mean for the world? Is there a use? What does it mean to think about the use of force without fossil fuels? Well, in the past, a lot of wars were waged partly because of fossil fuels. Anyway, it's a big question. I'm making big generalizations here, but I think for our room here, that decoupling is probably part of the conversation. Yeah.
Pauline, you wanted to jump in?
Because I was thinking as I was talking, but just to add that these ethical considerations, and I'm happy you raised them, they're not new. It's not something. It's not just which energy stakeholder is worth having a platform and is ethical enough to be showcased. Because if you like if you, in hindsight, this is all about, there's a risk of greenwashing from the outset. And that's just any defense industry stakeholder can be interested in, or a lot of them can be interested in being part of these conversations and showcasing their work and how they're greening. And many defense industry stakeholders have a sustainability section on their website. So just to say that it doesn't date back to like this edition of the summit, and it's something that has been constantly in front of our minds, because that's research work also from us to make sure, like, do we want to showcase sustainable fuels, for instance? What does it mean? But also decarbonizing defense. Is it in itself? So there's there's a whole philosophical also consideration to this, because in Europe they talk about degrowth, so it's not even about clean tech. So depending on where you stand from and which perspective, any choice of showcasing one technology could be debatable. But then I agree on the ones that you mentioned specifically that are the low-hanging fruit.
I will actually take a second, given that I'm an academic and I have nobody can fire me, so good luck trying. I think Burgess is actually hitting on something that is a common perception among a lot of people outside of this community, that certain actors are going to take advantage of this opportune moment to enrich themselves. And I will never forget the 2021 Berlin climate meeting when a Boeing representative stood up and was quite plain about how, the green transition for NATO was a wonderful opportunity for fleet renewal, because every new plane that they sell is going to be more energy efficient than the last one or the one that's currently in your fleet, right? So it's not hard for people to be cynical when we see carbon capture, for example, not living up to its promise, when we see some actors potentially taking advantage of situations for their own purposes. But I think it's also incumbent on all of us in this area to hold actors accountable and to have the dialogue to bring groups together, for example, who are doing carbon accounting of military operations, so that we know what the impacts are. Because as Duncan said this morning, what future armed forces will people support? Well, if people come to realize that our armed forces are a big part of the problem going forward in the next 20 or 30 years, that's going to have major impacts on the kinds of military renewal and support that we will see. The political action may actually force decision makers to go in a certain way. So I think it's incumbent on us to take those cynical or suspicious or skeptical considerations seriously in everything we do. Carl, please go ahead.
Thank you. I was going to talk about creating knowledge and what you discussed, but it sort of goes to show that, like 5 seconds ago, that was my focus, and now it's capitalism and geoengineering suddenly that's being debated. And I was also going to thank you. I agree with Sara. It's a great fora that you are creating, Bruno. Brings together so many different topics. I've learned a lot about cowboy hats in Alberta and methane gas in the South China Sea. And I think that's really important to have that sort of wide platforms that you and both Sara alert to. But I also think that it's important to keep the silos to a certain degree, because we often in DRR, we often talk about remove the silos. It's sort of a mantra that we always talk about. But actually, they serve a purpose. The silos do serve a purpose. They do. There is a certain language and there is a certain joint enthusiasm that you can only find in the silos. Yesterday, I ended up in an animated discussion about B-52s. And when I talk to my climate adaptation colleagues and bring up B-52s and how interesting it is what happened after the B-50, they wouldn't react really with the same enthusiasm.
Not the band.
No,
not the band.
Not the band. No, so we need to keep the silos because they generate an expertise and a sort of enthusiasm, engagement as sort of us. That is important to go forward. But I think I try and work in both of the legs, and I think you do, and many of you too, here in this room. You have to sort of learn a bit in each leg to try and to bring examples that echoes well in that chamber. I talked yesterday about flooding, and we brought in changes in our flooding risks in my contrast through bringing one of our pointiest head on civil defense to the group that discuss flood risk, and really looking at the defense perspective on flood risk and engaging them in that, but listening in to their knowledge. So I think building a community knowledge is about these kind of meetings, but it's also about building a capacity to have a leg in each silo. And what I'm trying to do a lot, which I think resonates well in the defense silo, is to have concrete examples. Whenever I can talk about sort of a energy line that was, laid in a specific way to protect against conflict and climate, that resonates really well. Although none of the people that I'm talking to are actually going to have anything to do with energy lines. It's practical, it's tangible, and it really helps. And that creates enthusiasm and wants them to engage more and discuss more. Just some points on creating knowledge, although I think capitalism and geoengineering is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Last question, right? Or do you want to respond, actually? Sure,
yeah,
go
just
ahead.
quickly. I don't think I said we should abolish silos.
No.
I agree with you. I can't do the chemistry that Alex does, right? The sort of AI craziness that he can do with his computer. I cannot do that. And he needs that specialization, just like I think my political questions as a political scientist and IR theorist are needed for the sort of work we do together. But I don't think that the problem, I think, especially in big bureaucracies of governments, is how silos become like defended behind, barbed wires and walls and whatnot. So I think we need to figure out ways where those silos are a bit more porous, agile, flexible, and maybe they need to abolish sometimes, to be honest. I think there's the question of adaptation. A lot of people have said over the last 2 days, we need to act more rapidly. We need decisions, we need action that go faster than what we do now. So how do you do that? I don't know. But it sounds to me the silos sometimes are, or regulation, or call it what you want, sometimes are obstacle to that. So yeah, I'm not against specialization of silos, but when people just fight over that, over their own backyard or whatever it is, we see it in academia too, right? Between departments, there's all sorts of fights there all the time, which is unfortunate. But I agree with you that sometimes specialization are necessary. They are necessary.
Jonas, last question.
I have a question for Pauline and Rachel on sort of the contradictory nature between good industrial policy and defense-based industrial primes. So in industrial policy, one of the main sort of guiding principles is you don't want to do a lead firm, you want to do a sector-wide policy to support a sector. So if one company sort of goes kaput, your policy is geared towards developing like a variety of companies or firms within a sector, right? But if you have in any defense base, and maybe this is less of an issue with dual use capacities because they can fulfill the civilian market as well, it has a sort of inherent logic to support a limited number of firms because historically defense firms, they build a small number of platforms for one client and they need to get that right? So it's kind of the inverse of good industrial policy. You want a small number of lead firms making high-ticket items in a very small quantity, which they need to get right. Now, obviously, this is shifting somewhat with a lot of sort of low-cost, high-tech thing with drones, but I was just kind of wondering if you guys have sort of had any thoughts, especially with the new build, partner, buy strategy, that as we try to build, for lack of a better word, Canadian defense primes, even though we have a few already, how do you avoid capture, right, by lead firms and also just avoiding, again, you've put all your eggs into one basket and it goes south. So just what are your thoughts on those principles?
I think actually one of the problems with Canadian industrial policy and the way it's been done in the past is that we've spread limited resources too thinly and haven't actually accomplished anything. So while in theory it's great to just provide everything, tax incentives to everybody in the same way and hope that you get the result, when we're talking about very specialized things or major investments, governments are going to have to be more limited in their focus. But that means that all of those things that I talked about on the governance side and the evaluation side become really, really important, because you do not want to be captured and you do not want to be just supporting the profits of a particular company. It has to be about the public interest. And so that's where all of those really strict mechanisms come into play, to be willing to change course, to use whatever levers are necessary to achieve the outcome that investment was set out to achieve. So I'm not opposed to the idea of having particular companies that are somewhat the champions, but it is a very big risk in terms of the public taxpayer dollars and achieving that outcome. So ideally, we can spread the money across more firms, but it might just not be practical.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not even sure. I think Rachel had it all. Yeah. No, but that's exactly the feedback that we've been receiving. I don't know where he is. Yeah, that we've been receiving from startups and smaller companies that, well, there are several. There's a signal, but that the policy signal is one thing, but then you need the actual incentive to make sure that producing domestically and selling domestically is more profitable than selling abroad. And that's still not the case. I was talking about it with Victor Jacquet, who's advocating also for reform at this level in operationalizing the defense industrial strategy to make sure that as it stands, it doesn't benefit only the prime contractors. Then at our more humble levels, it's making sure that we showcase, and I feel like I'm going back to the Montreal Summit all the time, and I'm not here to just talk about this, but that's the point I can raise, is to we want to make sure that we showcase the smaller initiatives, and that it's not going to be completely bought by the primes. But yeah, it's a matter of platform and visibility that they don't necessarily have. Even like CanSec forums are very big forums where they try to have a presence, but it's not always the audience that is tailored to what they have to offer when it comes to climate resiliency solutions. And so yeah, they do need platform and visibility, but then there's also the financial incentive of making sure it's profitable.
Thank you. Let me please ask you all to thank our panelists in person and Brigadier-General Parent online. Before we turn it over to Bruno, thank you everybody for your contributions. And now I'll turn it over to Bruno to close out the meeting.
Yeah, it won't take long. I just want to, je vais faire mes remerciements. Just want to give my thanks again to everyone. Thank you. Merci au Casco pour le soutien financier nécessaire. Thank you to Casco for financial support. Thank you to UQAM. Merci beaucoup à la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand, mes collègues de la Chaire, Louis, Daphné, Stéphanie, Françoise. Thanks also to the fellows keep coming back. So Burgess and Jonas, if I didn't say it earlier, they were our original fellows. Thanks, Greg. For the support and all that. Thank you, Rachel, and the RPP. We'll have a lot to talk about for that post-conference report and what comes out of this. And of course, thank you all very much for your very valuable time, your engagement, your ideas, sharing and all that, your friendship. See you soon, I hope. Thank you.